Ukraine is fighting a war on two fronts, against Russia's onslaught and America's slanders. Meanwhile, Moscow's on track to lose 1 million men by its so-called Victory Day parade in May. Kharkiv again. My name is Jerome Starkey. I'm the defence editor at The Sun newspaper, and this is Frontline, your weekly roundup of the most important news and analysis from and about the war in Ukraine. We're starting really with the diplomatic front because it has been extraordinary over the last few days. And we're going to talk about three things: what's happened, why it's happened, and what that means. But fundamentally, this has been a shift in position, in America's position, or at least the White House's position, laid out by Donald Trump. It started when Donald Trump announced that he had held a phone call with Vladimir Putin, which blindsided Ukraine and its allies.
I think he wants to stop fighting. I see that. We spoke long and hard.
We then saw America's Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, meeting Russia's Foreign Secretary, Sergei Lavrov, and various delegates in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia. Again, peace talks where Ukraine had been frozen out of them. As this was happening, we saw European allies scrambling to hold a meeting in Paris, attended by the United Kingdom. Britain's Prime Minister Keir Starmer said that he would be willing to send British forces to support some kind of peace deal were that to happen, to offer Ukraine security guarantees, but the Russians ruled that out, so they categorically would not accept NATO forces. But it gets worse. We then heard Donald Trump calling President Zelensky a dictator, suggesting totally incorrectly that President Zelensky's popularity in Ukraine is just 4%. In fact, latest polls suggest President Zelensky's approval rating is roughly the same, if not actually slightly higher than Donald Trump's. Both of them around the 50% mark. Zelensky, the latest polls suggest it went up since December from 52 to 57. Trump claiming that Zelensky started the war and that he'd missed opportunities to end it.
He refuses to have elections, is low in the real Ukrainian polls. I mean, how can you be high with every city is being demolished?
President Zelensky responded by suggesting that Donald Trump was operating inside a disinformation bubble and has subsequently been told to tone it down by White House officials. There is a ferocious war of words between Kyiv and, I was going to say Washington, but actually most of this coming out of Mar-a-Lago, Donald Trump's residence in Florida. The latest development: Elon Musk, a close aide to Donald Trump, America's, indeed the world's richest man, calling Ukraine a massive graft machine feeding off the dead bodies of Ukrainian soldiers. This is really emotive language. Musk repeating Donald Trump's suggestions, demands that Ukraine needs to hold an election, and that Zelensky, by failing to hold an election, has become a dictator, has become some sort of tyrant. We've also heard from Donald Trump that he said Russia has the cards in negotiations because it's taken so much territory. This has come as a real shock. We've seen Ukraine's allies, we've seen Prime Minister Keir Starmer calling up President Zelensky, making clear that Britain believes him to be a democratically elected leader and understands the reasons why there have not been elections as would be normally scheduled. It's very simple. Ukraine is at war. It has declared martial law to cope with that situation of all-out conflict. There's no real doubt most Ukrainians, many Ukrainians, would love to be able to hold normal democratic elections as they should have done. The reason they can't is because Russia has invaded. Russia has forced this war on them. Ukraine's allies, United Kingdom, NATO have made it very clear that they hold Russia responsible for starting this war, not Ukraine, as Donald Trump has said. So these comments, this war of words, not just really between the White House and Ukraine, but also opening up fractures between the rest of NATO, Europe and America. Even recently, Nigel Farage, the leader of the Reform Party in the United Kingdom, in many ways a political ally of Donald Trump, certainly Farage, a fan and sometime apologist of Trump, has said, let us be clear, Zelensky is not a dictator. So why has this happened? Well, it's a really good question, something I'm sure historians will pore over for years, if not decades. Donald Trump had repeatedly vowed to end the war in Ukraine. He said this war would never have started if he had been in power instead of President Joe Biden. He said it would end it in a day, and then as his current term in office approached, his aide suggested that 100 days was a more likely timeframe. A month into his second term in office, he appears to be taking very drastic steps to try and end it quickly. We know Donald Trump likes wrong-footing both his friends and his allies by shooting from the hip. He is wildly unpredictable, and we are seeing that from what he is saying about Ukraine. But I think there's something more fundamental that we can't ignore. Donald Trump has repeatedly expressed his admiration for Russian tyrant Vladimir Putin. He's called him savvy. He's called him a genius. It's hard to escape the idea that Trump has some sort of man crush. He is awestruck by the Kremlin strongman. We also know that Donald Trump has a vendetta against President Zelensky and has expressed a hatred for Ukraine. It was Donald Trump's phone call with President Zelensky in 2019 in which Donald Trump threatened to withdraw American aid if Zelensky did not dish dirt on President Biden. It was that phone call which ultimately led to Donald Trump getting impeached. Donald Trump holds Zelensky largely accountable for that process. John Bolton, who used to work very closely in Trump's first White House administration, has written about how Trump hates Zelensky, or rather hates Ukraine, considers them corrupt, thinks that Ukraine attacked Trump personally and had no desire to meet Zelensky. There is beef, there is history between these two men, and Trump clearly bears those grudges, and we are seeing that play out. What does it mean? Well, in the short term, Ukraine feels stabbed in the back. Ukraine is losing, has lost tens of thousands of its very best men and women resisting this Russian invasion, and they are facing the prospect of seeing the rug pulled out from underneath the feet, the rug of American and international support. America's allies in Europe and NATO are nervous. They are asking themselves, and they've been asking themselves for some time, how much of this can they do? How much support for Ukraine can they continue to provide if America stops? Russia appears to be rubbing its hands over the last week with all that has been coming out, with these fractures appearing among Ukraine, America and their allies. In the medium term, this appears to be taking the pressure off Russia. Both Russia and Ukraine are under immense pressure at the moment as this war approaches its 3-year anniversary. Russia is under financial pressure. Its economy is running hot. We've talked about this before. Inflation, interest rates, 40% of its annual budget is going on security and defence. And experts that I've spoken to suggest that they envisage that by the end of this year, towards the autumn, that is when they really expect Russia's economy to be pushed to breaking point, the point where it might explode or implode, and Moscow might find itself unable to continue to fund this war. It's that sort of economic collapse that may precipitate the public unrest, popular disillusionment with President Putin's policies that might force him to cause track. But we're not there yet. Russia is also under pressure in terms of its casualties. I mentioned before, it's on track to have lost 1 million men dead and wounded by the time Vladimir Putin sits down in Red Square for his so-called Victory Day parade on May the 9th. Well, how do we know this? Western estimates suggest it's lost around 850,000 soldiers so far. Now, most of those are wounded, but a huge chunk of them, about a quarter perhaps, are dead. it is losing at the moment around 1,400 to 1,500 soldiers a day in this war of attrition. Now, there's about 80 days, just shy of 80 days between now and May 9th. That would be on those sorts of, on that trajectory. That would be another 120,000 casualties between now and May 9th. So 120,000 plus 850 takes us to 970 casualties by Russia's Victory Day. What Donald Trump is doing, or appears to be doing, is taking that pressure off Russia, giving Vladimir Putin breathing space, because Trump has already said in his opening comments that he will never accept Ukraine as a member of NATO, and that Kyiv needs to renounce its claims or its ambition of recovering territory that it has lost to Russia. So what he's describing is freezing the conflict. But by saying that so openly and so early, he appears to be giving away the levers that Ukraine and the West may have used to negotiate with Russia. We're going to talk a little bit about what else has been happening on the battlefield in Ukraine. There has been a really shocking investigation published by the Financial Times into what appears to be a systematic Russian policy of executing captured and defenseless prisoners of war on the battlefield. War crimes investigators in Ukraine believe at least 133 Ukrainian prisoners of war have been killed in more than 45 incidents in 2024 alone. In one of the most shocking, there was footage of a Russian soldier, a hooded, masked Russian soldier, barking at his comrades, "Film me," before he opens fire with a Kalashnikov assault rifle at kneeling, unarmed Ukrainian soldiers. There have been many, many other incidents. We've seen from 2023, perhaps even earlier, Ukrainian prisoners of war being shot by firing squads. I've seen footage of Ukrainian soldiers being beheaded. I've seen horrific footage of a Ukrainian prisoner being castrated and then shot. It is unspeakable. But the significant thing about this investigation is it appears to show that this has become systemic. This appears to have been endorsed by the Russian chain of command. And indeed, many of the units that have been linked to these atrocities have received awards for courage and bravery from the Kremlin. Indeed, at least one unit from Vladimir Putin himself. Now, the Financial Times investigation managed to identify that hooded masked soldier behind that incident I was describing, when he and other soldiers shot 6 kneeling prisoners of war, and they contacted him. He denied it when they contacted him, but interestingly, he said that the person who killed the Ukrainians killed them with reason. So he wasn't suggesting it hadn't happened, he wasn't denying it, and he was clearly aware of the incident. I would suggest that the FT had found the right person. In other news, Ukraine's GUR military intelligence agency claims that it's been behind the blinding of at least 8 Russian drone operators by getting explosives into the goggles that these soldiers wear when they are flying drones. Now, this is a sort of supply chain attack reminiscent on a much smaller scale of what we saw Israel's Mossad achieve by making Lebanon's Hezbollah pagers explode. Ukraine claiming that it managed to get these explosives into the supply chain, that these goggles have been supplied to at least 8 drone operators all across the front line in various different parts of the front line. Evidence of the savagery, if I must say, of this conflict. I mean, the desperate measures that sides are forced to go. Nonetheless, as unpleasant as it is to read about, these are clearly attacks against legitimate military targets, against military opponents who are prosecuting the war against Ukraine. A reminder that Ukraine continues to mount this sabotage campaign behind the front lines, because whilst this war of attrition takes an enormous toll in the trenches and in the positions where they face off against each other, Ukraine is trying to gain advantage behind the front lines. And we've also seen that with a car bomb just recently, which appears to have reportedly killed the Russian-appointed governor of Berdyansk near the Sea of Azov, which is on the Sea of Azov, one of the Russian-occupied cities, been occupied since the early stages of the conflict. We've seen a fire at an arms plant in Moscow. And in Kursk, that pocket of territory which Ukraine has captured, we appear to see North Korean troops back in the fight. Ukraine's GUR and soldiers who are engaged in that fight giving supporting accounts. that the North Koreans are both engaged in the fight, that they are now embedded with Russian units. They appear to have changed their tactics slightly. Instead of launching large assaults with up to 50 men at a time, they're launching smaller assaults in groups of 10 to 15. It's something we've seen in the eastern Donbass, actually, Russian soldiers moving down to groups of around 6. That's in order to try and present less appealing, less attractive, less obvious targets to the drones and to artillery, which are so powerful in this conflict. And there's also emerged footage for the first time of a Koksan, an M1978 self-propelled North Korean howitzer being destroyed. As ever, if you have any questions, please do ask them in the comments below, and we'll endeavour to answer as many as we can in our next update. And I'll always get into the comments as well and answer them there where I can. One of you asking, will Russia pay to rebuild Ukraine? Well, it's a really good question. It's a chance for us to look briefly at the $300 billion worth of Russian assets, which are currently frozen. Now, the interest payments from those frozen assets are being funneled to Ukraine to allow Ukraine to continue to defend itself and to try and resist the Russian invasion. There have been clamours among Ukraine's allies to seize those assets, not just to take the interest, but to seize those assets, to use that Russian money. Now, depending on when and if that Russian money is taken, then it might be used either to help Ukraine defend itself, or feasibly might be used to help Ukraine rebuild itself. At the moment, though, it seems too early to talk about how Ukraine will rebuild itself because the war is still ongoing. And as I've said many times, no sane person who has witnessed what is happening, no sane person who's seen the slaughter, who's felt the fear, as I have, wants this to last one day longer than it has to, but how it ends matters. The terms of the ceasefire, of the peace deal are all important, because not only does it frame whether or not Russia sees this as a victory and a vindication of the use of force, it will also determine fundamentals, as that question gets to, about who will rebuild the country. And the next question, and the final question for this week, is if Putin had his time again, would he invade Ukraine? And I think that's a really important question, because ultimately, I think the only way we can answer that is once we know how this war ends. Right now, or at least if you'd asked me that question perhaps a few months ago, I would say no. If Putin had his time again, he would not have done the same things again, because I think Vladimir Putin made a fundamental miscalculation in February 2022 when he launched this war about how Ukraine and Ukraine's allies would react. Let's remember, he thought this was going to be a quick campaign. Ukraine would collapse, the government would fall, he would install a friendly government on Russian terms. That didn't happen. It hasn't happened at all. His 3-day campaign, his 3-week campaign has become a 3-year slaughter. But what we've heard recently from Donald Trump suggests that actually Vladimir Putin may yet achieve his war objectives, not his maximalist objectives, not his primary objectives, which were the complete subjugation of Ukraine, but certainly it's looking like he may achieve his secondary objectives, which was to seize large swathes of Ukrainian territory and annex it into Russia for the long term. Thank you very, very much for watching. If you've got any questions, please do ask them in the comments below. And remember, you can join Frontline to get exclusive access to member-only content, use of exclusive emojis and a badge, so that we will be able to see who you are in the comments. In this week's members-only content, we're going to be looking at Ukraine's rare earth minerals. What are they? What's their value? And why does Donald Trump want them? In a Ukrainian armoured vehicle, and we're heading towards the Russian border.